In the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, surrounded by dense jungle and endless rivers, lies one of the strangest places on Earth. If you traveled there today, you would see something that makes absolutely no sense. You would see rusted American fire hydrants on the streets. You would see the ruins of a massive hospital that looks like it belongs in Michigan. You would see the remains of a golf course now completely swallowed by vines and trees. This isn't a lost civilization from ancient times, and it isn't a movie set for a horror film, although it certainly looks like one. This is Fordlandia. Almost 100 years ago, the richest man in the world decided he was going to conquer the Amazon rainforest. He wasn't looking for gold, and he wasn't looking for oil. He was looking for rubber. He wanted to build a perfect American society in the middle of the jungle. He had unlimited money, the best engineers, and the arrogance of a man who had never failed. But the jungle didn't care about his money. And what happened next is one of the most spectacular failures in the history of capitalism. This is the story of how Henry Ford tried to tame the Amazon, and how the Amazon fought back. To understand why this disaster happened, we have to go back to the 1920s. Picture this. Henry Ford is the king of the industrial world. His Model T cars are everywhere. He has perfected the assembly line. He owns the steel mills, the glass factories, and the ships that transport his materials. He controls everything. Well, almost everything. There was one thing Henry Ford did not own, and it was driving him crazy: rubber. You can't make a car without tires. And in the 1920s, the world's rubber supply was controlled by a cartel of British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. They controlled the price, and they made Ford pay a fortune. Henry Ford was a man who hated relying on anyone. He looked at these prices and said, "Enough. I will grow my own rubber." But rubber trees don't grow in Detroit. They need heat. They need humidity. They need the tropics. So, Ford looked at the map and his finger landed on Brazil, specifically the Amazon basin, the place where the rubber tree was originally born. Ideally, it seemed like the perfect plan. He would buy a massive piece of land, cut out the middleman, and produce cheap tires for his empire. It sounded simple, but as we know, nothing in the Amazon is simple. In 1927, Ford negotiated a deal with the Brazilian government. He bought a tract of land on the banks of the Tapajós River. The size of this property was staggering. It was nearly 14,000 square kilometers. That is roughly the size of the state of Connecticut, or larger than some entire countries in Europe. He named it Fordlandia. But here is the first mistake, and it was a big one. Ford didn't send botanists or biologists to scout the land. He didn't send people who understood the rainforests. He sent factory managers. He sent engineers from the Midwest of the United States. When the Americans arrived, they were shocked. It was hot, it was humid, and it was full of insects. But they had orders to build a civilized town, and they did. Ships arrived from the United States carrying everything you can imagine. They brought cement, wood, glass, door handles, and even entire prefabricated houses. They built a modern hospital, which was actually the best hospital in the entire Amazon region at the time. They built schools, a power plant, a sawmill, and rows of neat white houses with front porches. It was a slice of small-town America, dropped right into the wildest place on the planet. Now, imagine being a local Brazilian worker in the 1930s. You are used to the rhythms of the river and the forest. You are used to working early in the morning to avoid the midday sun. And then, you get a job at Fordlandia suddenly. You are forced to punch a time clock. You have to work from 9 to 5, right through the hottest part of the day, because that is how they do it in Detroit. The metal roofs of the factories turned into ovens under the tropical sun. But it wasn't just the work hours. It was the lifestyle. Henry Ford was a strict man with very specific beliefs. He hated alcohol, and he believed in a very specific diet. He tried to force this lifestyle on the Brazilian workers. The cabak. Alcohol was completely banned in Fordlandia. It was a dry town. Boats would smuggle rum across the river, turning the jungle into a scene from a gangster movie. And then there was the food. The workers were used to eating fish, meat, and manioc flour. But Ford's managers served them American food: oatmeal, canned peaches, and wheat bread. They were trying to fuel manual laborers in the tropics with the diet of an office worker in Michigan. It was a sociological experiment, and the subjects of the experiment were getting angry. The tension in the air was thicker than the humidity. The Americans lived in their fancy houses on the hill, known as the American Village, while the Brazilian workers lived in simpler barracks. The cultural clash was a ticking time bomb, and in December 1930, that bomb finally exploded. It started in the cafeteria. A worker, tired of the terrible food and the strict rules, started an argument with the supervisor. Within minutes, it turned into a full-scale riot. This event became known as the Breaking Pots Riot. The workers grabbed whatever weapons they could find: kitchen pans, sticks, and machetes. They destroyed the cafeteria. They smashed the time clocks that they hated so much. They cut the electricity lines and flipped over the trucks. The American managers were terrified. They had to run for their lives, fleeing into the jungle and hiding on boats in the middle of the river for days. The Brazilian army eventually had to fly in to restore order. Fordlandia had survived the riot, but the dream was cracking. Henry Ford fired some managers and tried to make changes, but the human problem was nothing compared to what nature had in store for them. While the humans were fighting each other, a silent killer was spreading through the plantation. You see, in the wild Amazon, rubber trees grow far apart from each other. This is nature's way of protecting them. If one tree gets sick, the disease doesn't easily jump to the next one because there are other types of trees in between. But Henry Ford applied the logic of the factory assembly line to nature. He ordered his men to plant the rubber trees in tight, neat rows, packed closely together. To a botanist, this is suicide. To a fungus, this is an all-you-can-eat buffet. A disease called the South American leaf blight began to attack. It is a fungus that destroys the leaves, suffocating the tree. Because the trees were so close together, the spores traveled on the wind, jumping from one tree to the next at incredible speed. It was a massacre. The engineers tried everything. They sprayed chemicals. They spent thousands of dollars, but the trees kept dying. The plantation looked like a graveyard of dead wood. Ford had conquered the steel industry, but he was completely powerless against a microscopic fungus. Ford stubbornly tried again. He moved the operation to a new location called Belterra, thinking a flatter land would help, but the result was the same. The fungus always won. By 1945, the world had changed. World War II drove the invention of synthetic rubber, made from petroleum. The demand for natural rubber dropped. The experiment was over. Henry Ford's grandson eventually sold the land back to the Brazilian government for a tiny fraction of what they had spent. It is estimated that Ford lost over $20 million on this project, hundreds of millions in today's money. And here is the saddest irony of all. Henry Ford, the man whose vision built this city, never actually visited Brazil. He never saw the White Houses. He never saw the jungle. And he never saw the jungle. And he never saw the ruin of his dream. Today, Fordlandia is still there. People live in the houses that Ford built. The water tower still stands over the forest like a rusty sentinel. It is a fascinating place to visit, but also a humble reminder. It reminds us that technology and money have limits. You can build a factory anywhere, but you cannot force nature to work on an assembly line. If you enjoyed this story of ambition and failure, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We are uncovering the hidden history of Brazil, one story at a time. Thanks for watching.